We talked about a lot of different things today. How climate change is a threat to a lot of things that are going to happen to us in the future and happening to us now. We've had words about how to tell your story, and we talked to some wonderful students who are really making change with their campus and in their community. Now we're going to get into a topic that I think is very important for us to discuss about how we already have areas that are already exacerbated by environmental injustice issues, whether people live next to a coal plant, if they have issues with their water not being clean, you live sea level rise, you're a place that's prone for natural disasters, and we're going to dive into how climate change is only going to make what those people who are going through a worse situation. If you're already dealing with hurricanes that come, every year. My best friend lives in Miami. There's hurricane season happens, where they go through all that. But now they're going to start seeing hurricanes that are worse because climate change is making them stronger and making them last longer. So Danielle Purifoy, did I say that right? Purifoy. She is a lawyer and geographer at UNC-Chapel Hill, and she graduated from the Nicholas School in 2018. She's going to come and share her wisdom with us about how climate change become a threat multiplier to issues that are already taking place. And she's going to dive into the issues here in North Carolina because this is where she's working. And let's welcome her to share her wisdom with us. And I hope you all enjoy it.
So it hasn't been very long since I've been here, and I just went up the street to UNC. So it's good to be back here in such a short turnaround. I was actually at the Marine Lab 2 days ago for the orientation. He's always and it was actually my first time going there. I never actually managed to get there while I was doing the PhD. So it was good to connect with those folks there and good to be back here. As Alora said, I'm going to talk a little bit about some connections between the work that sort of I've been doing over the past 6 years and beyond that on environmental justice issues that are on the ground, and some work that I know you all are here to think about climate change and broader sort of climate justice issues, which to foreground this conversation, which I'm hoping it'll be a little bit more of a conversation. If you have questions, please raise your hand during, and I'll answer them throughout the presentation. You don't need to wait till the end. I am not a climate change expert. This is not an area that I study. It's something that essentially I keep running into, right, in my environmental justice research. Sort of every particular case that I come across, there is, and I think that this is not a coincidence, right, there is a direct connection, right, to a climate change issue that folks are fighting, seemingly in silos kind of over here, right? So part of, I think, my work over the past few years with Catherine Flowers, right, who started work with Climate Reality, has been actually trying to pull those pieces together. And so I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about those connections and how to make them a little bit more concrete in a few cases that I've come across over the last several years. And hopefully that'll make it a little bit more concrete. And a lot of you probably have a lot more of the sort of scientific background to climate change than I do. So I'm just sort of trying to create a kind of framework for how we can be thinking in a less siloed manner about how these things are connected. Okay. Sorry. Okay. So I'm going to focus on the sort of three major greenhouse gases that we think of as being responsible for the global warming that we've been experiencing, right, and broader sort of climate weirding, as some people call it. So the first is sort of the one that everyone is probably most familiar with, carbon dioxide. The second is methane, and the third is nitrous oxide. These are things that I've sort of come to learn sort of by the by. And again, because of running into particular industries that are associated, right, with these greenhouse gases that are disproportionately impacting communities of color, and low-income communities. And I mostly focused in North Carolina, but I did sort of my earliest work in New Orleans. So one of the cases I'll talk about today is in New Orleans. So it's actually this first case. So CO2. This is actually a photo of Interstate 10 in New Orleans. This is heading into New Orleans East, where there is, which you may know, is one of the largest Vietnamese communities outside of Vietnam in the world. And then also a community, well, New Orleans is still a very African-American city, but a high concentration of actually mostly middle-class Black folks in Eastern New Orleans East, they call it. And I use this the I-10 ramp or I-10 as a representation of CO2 because, as we know, right, mobile sources, right, are a major mobile vehicles are a major source of CO2 emissions. There are all sorts of other sources of CO2 emissions, but this one in particular, I mean, coal-fired power plants also have a direct connection to many environmental justice cases. But the mobile sources are really linked a lot to the build out of our infrastructure, our highway infrastructure, and started in sort of the 1950s through the 1970s. And if you follow that history, you'll know something about how those highways were built and sort of through what communities they were built. So the I-10, Interstate 10 was actually one of the bigger cases, environmental justice cases in the 1960s, I believe, so this sort of elevated overpass here was built through several historically Black communities in the middle of New Orleans. And we credit, right, this is important, and this is important in part because we credit, for the history of climate change, because we credit the extension, sort of the build out of this highway system, interstate system, with the increase in our reliance on mobile sources and sort of our shift away from other kinds of transportation methods, right? We may have had we not been able politically, right, to build out an interstate system like this, we may have resorted to other transportation means like a better interstate rail, right, system that may have had different implications for climate change today. So there's a really important kind of grounded, right, history in the sort of CO2 emissions that we're seeing today and the sort of infrastructure that was allowed to be built, right, many decades ago at the direct expense of Black communities and their displacement. So, over on top of that, when these interstates were built, and I'm still focused here on New Orleans, we still were under a regime that allowed leaded gasoline. And so what ended up happening is, lead is elemental. It does not break down, and it's heavily toxic in all sorts of ways, cause a lot of neurological damage, developmental delays, particularly in children, and all sorts of health complications, and actually can be passed. Lead poisoning can actually be passed down from generation to generation through cord blood, right? Sort of umbilical cord blood. And when I actually started my work in environmental justice, this was one of the first projects I was working on. Is sort of the legacies of lead contamination in soil in New Orleans. And so this is what we call a soil lead map of New Orleans. You can see the Mississippi River. That's the sort of white, sort of bendy, curvy thing that's going through the city. And as you can see, as sort of the orange colors get darker and darker into reds, that's sort of the higher concentrations of lead in soil. Now, the technical safe allowable levels of soil lead, according to the EPA, are still at 400 parts per million. If you go outside of the United States, if you just go to Canada, right, that number drops down considerably. There are some countries that say no more than 100 parts per million, and then there are some that say there's no safe level of lead, right? So we are amongst countries that really sort of measure or have these kinds of standards. We're very much on the high end in terms of what is considered clean, which means that we may still be putting people at risk, right? Even at levels that are legally clean, right? But in New Orleans, and what you see those sort of hot spots are in this area called Central City, New Orleans. The soils contain up to 1,000 parts per million lead. So this soil lead map was done in the 2000s. This was around the time that I was doing this work in New Orleans. And because, right, we understand that lead doesn't break down, and it's also quite stable, it doesn't move very much, right, that you don't actually need to do these maps, right, like repeatedly over and over again in order to sort of, you get very similar pictures over time. And so the connections that Howard Milkey, who is one of the foremost experts in lead and children's health in the country, have made to sort of a sort of causal story for how we sort of got this particular kind of map, is that really this map maps pretty well onto a map of I-10. And part of that, right, is because of lead in gasoline, right, that settles into soil over time and does not break down. But even now, right, that we do not have leaded gasoline anymore. I mean, even unleaded gasoline, I should say, right, has like trace elements of lead in it, right? So you're not totally lead-free, but you're a lot less lead than we had up until the 70s, right? So we're talking, what we're looking at now is at least, right, you know, from the time that the I-10 interstate was built, and even before then, because we still had cars sort of going through these areas before, but particularly when you start to see traffic patterns increase in those places, you start to see an increase, right, in the concentration of lead in those areas in Central City, New Orleans, which is still, you know, there were Black communities that were displaced by the highways, but there's still a number of historic Black communities that live surrounding that immediate highway infrastructure. There are other sources of lead, right? Old housing stock, right, which New Orleans has plenty of, right? The lead paint, people call it sort of one of the main culprits. And all of these sorts of things, right? Like even if you do remediation of lead in homes, that paint all sort of settles down into soil. And if you don't do some sort of extractive method or remediation method, then it just stays there, right? And it poses a risk. The other thing that I actually didn't understand about this, I knew about leaded soils and I knew leaded gasoline, and I knew a little bit about lead paint, is that actually the wheel bearings, right, in our cars, right, also have lead, right, and they still have lead. So there are all sorts of, and that's less, right, like in terms of the sources of lead, sort of a much smaller amount. But the bottom line is that when you have an infrastructure built, right, that is providing, right, like a conduit for that kind of traffic, right, you can actually see the immense disparities in sort of how something like lead, right, as poisonous as lead is sort of concentrated in one particular area. And that's not, right, to say nothing of all of sort of the other sort of tailpipe emissions and all of the kinds of health impacts, right, from over congestion and traffic that come from those particular mobile sources concentrated there. So this is kind of one case, right, of how we can kind of think of the intersections between something that, you know, folks over here are talking about as CO2 emissions from mobile sources, right? And what folks over here are talking about is infrastructure displacement, right? Respiratory illness and lead poisoning, right? And sort of all of these kinds of things are sort of co-produced by the same practices, right? And the political practice of destroying these communities in the first place, right, to build these highways is part and parcel of what environmental justice activists and advocates are talking about in terms of thinking about like how we restructure, right, our politics, right, and how we actually really address legacies of racism, ongoing structural racism, and our policies and practices that allow these sorts of things to happen, right? Because the what we call sort of the multiplier effect of that is that what we're faced with right now, right, is this sort of push now to kind of at least decrease the emissions of mobile sources, right, or take more mobile sources off the road, or in some cases dismantle, right, these highway infrastructures altogether. Whereas if we had actually had a better means, right, of our politics, right, of our environmental decision makings, and a lot more focus on the kind of equity in these sorts of situations, we may have avoided a lot of these situations to begin with. Okay, so that's just one case, right, and that's just kind of CO2. Although obviously there are a number of other, right, toxins that are that may or may not be related to climate change that are implicated here. So the second is methane. And have y'all talked at all today about the hog industry? People talk about the hog industry a lot, so I didn't want to overdo that. Okay. How many of you know something about the hog industry in North Carolina? Okay, great. Okay, so I don't need to like beat you over the head with it because it's like the first thing everyone like sort of talks about. I mean, it's very important, but you know. So so one of the second, and this is, you know, and y'all can actually correct me on this if I'm wrong. What I have read, right, is that there had been sort of more evidence now, right, that methane, in terms of its heat trapping, right, properties, is actually a bit more perilous in some sense than CO2, as far as our sort of broader picture of global warming is concerned. Is that correct? I think that's about right, right? Okay, I'm not a climate scientist, so I always feel weird like making claims about these things. So, and so there is, I have seen at least, and especially in our sort of conversations around environmental justice, an increased focus on thinking about methane, right? As environmental justice advocates are thinking about climate change, particularly because in North Carolina, we have the second highest sort of concentration of hogs and sort of industrial hog farms in the country, right? We're second only to Iowa. And these industrial hog farms produce a lot of methane, right? And part of it, in large part, right, because of our sort of heavy concentration of sort of thousands of hogs in confined conditions, and then also the sort of pools of waste, right, in these what we call lagoons that are sort of just open pits, right, of hog waste that we have. And so to the extent that we have kind of talked about, right, like greenhouse gases within the EJ movement in North Carolina, we've really talked a lot about methane. And I just heard, I walked in the middle of sort of the Q&A about the biogas industry, and that's, as you heard, right, a sort of industry that is sort of being touted as a green-friendly, complementary, right, industry to the industrial hog farms in eastern North Carolina. Let's see how to talk about these. In the 70s and 80s, right, if you had sort of driven through North Carolina, you would have seen a a lot of hog farms, right? Probably in the hundreds, numbering in the hundreds of sort of family hog farms that were pretty quickly overtaken in the last about 40 years by major agribusiness, right? Smithfield, where am I blanking on the other well, it's now WH Group, right? But it was Smithfield, and then there's another one that I'm like blanking on right now. That's a really big deal in terms of owning, right, most of the hog production in Eastern North Carolina. And so the methane, right, is produced from these massive hog operations, and some of it, right, is siphoned off to sort of in a kind of like a localized home run, essentially like biogas, right, anaerobic digesters, right, in on people's farms, right. So that has been. So I don't want to be ahistorical. That has been, right, like historically with these major farms, how a lot of farmers. Or we shouldn't call them farmers, they're contract growers for the agribusiness, have produced energy on the farm, okay? But of course, it's like way too much, right? Way too much methane, way too much sort of gas coming off of those things to be sort of contained within sort of a household or sort of local farm operation, which is part of why you're starting to see, right, a kind of massive push, right, for building more biogas industry in Eastern North Carolina. So that's sort of one way to think about it, right, in terms of climate change that we are, can see here. We have these sort of, I want to connect this actually to the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, which is another piece of this kind of biogas, this sort of methane puzzle that is sort of cropping up in Eastern North Carolina right now that we're actually trying to work a bit in the North Carolina Environmental Justice Network to connect the two of these things, right? These are both sort of methane producing industries. There's all of this push all of a sudden for a biogas industry that would take more of the methane off the top of these hog waste lagoons as a green solution, right, to protect the communities that have been filing lawsuits and complaining about the health impacts of the industry for so long. But they've coincided, right, with the building of this massive pipeline that folks in Eastern North Carolina are also fighting for similar reasons, right? Because one of the things we know is that this is yet another, right, like contributor to greenhouse gases. The number of pipelines that have had major incidences in these communities is quite high, actually, and the pipelines, something that I learned recently is that the pipelines that have been built in the last 40 years are really responsible for most of the most recent accidents. It's not the older pipelines, sort of the older infrastructure breaking down, it's sort of the hastily built, right, like pipelines and infrastructure there. So there's been this sort of, what's happened in Eastern North Carolina is that folks have been dealing with this hog industry for so long and the impacts from the waste, the air, the water impacts, right? The various impacts that come from the bacteria, right? There's all sorts of studies on hog staph infections, right? And all of those sorts of illnesses arising from just having the farms there. And now there is this push, right, that is called a great rift, right? Particularly between contract growers, right, who are exploited by the Smithfields, right, and the WH group, and the community members, some of who work, right, for the contract growers. These folks have historically had some kind of solidarity in the sense that they're both being, right, exploited by these larger agribusinesses. But the contract growers up until now have only have been sort of grappling with the fact that the only thing that they really own is the waste from these farms. And the biogas industry actually provides an opportunity, right, for them to start to turn a profit, right, from this waste. So there was recently a North Carolina Environmental Justice Roundtable event and a press conference in which sort of the rifts, right, between the contract growers and the community members surrounding these farms is apparent and growing, right? And so essentially what we have is sort of the Duke Energies of the world, which actually have not historically been very embedded in Eastern North Carolina. It's actually been a lot of the smaller regional utilities, which charge these sort of outrageous fees to residents there. They're sort of coming in and becoming part of the sort of political power plays that are around this issue, right? So there are, we can talk about this more kind of in the Q&A and if other folks have questions, but there's sort of many layers to this issue.
So since Hurricane Florence, do you think that it will continue to be such a major issue because half of the hog industry has now been wiped out now? Do you think there's a way for there to be a fight to prevent those hog farms from coming back?
That's a great question. I have not heard anyone express any sort of hope that that Hurricane Florence will actually have some sort of effect of alleviating, right, like this problem or sort of preventing these farms from coming back. I think that the presence of the sort of building out of this biogas industry, and again, we're still trying to make a connection or try to figure out what the connection is. We've had mixed stories between this emerging biogas industry and the Atlantic Coast Pipeline. Some folks say, they don't want to have anything to do with those are two separate things, and others have said no, like it's just sort of part of a longer range plan, and these hog farms will eventually be part of that kind of operating system. So, you know, it's hard to say what would have happened had we not had this sort of complementary industry sort of being built up simultaneously with Florence. We do still have technically a moratorium on building new hog farms, but what we've seen is a sort of displacement mode that's happened where we've actually seen a larger proliferation of the, I mean, you don't even have to call it a displacement mode, but like we haven't seen a growth in the number of existing hog farms because of the moratorium, but then we've also seen this sort of skyrocketing of poultry CAFOs, right? So, and those are the litter from those plants are also, right, considered, right, energy fodder. So there's a ton of, right, like these issues. And so the bottom line is that in Eastern North Carolina, there's sort of, you know, we could talk about climate change, certainly, right? We can talk about all of these emissions, but these emissions are very much wrapped up, right, in these sort of local political, like really entrenched, politics that are heavily racialized, right? And that, I would argue, right, is sort of the environmental justice lens or approach is a sharper one, right, in order to kind of like figure out and tease through the sort of dynamics and the kind of organizing, right, the sort of political organizing and campaigning that would be required to sort of defeat something like the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, right? It's not enough to sort of point to the amount of emissions that are coming from these areas. I mean, this particular region of the state, right, has been exploited in those ways for a very long time. Okay, great. Great. So I'll just say the last one that I wanted to talk about is the nitrous oxide. It's a relatively sort of smaller player in terms of our public discourse, but there is a really important component to this in connection to environmental justice, and that is through the fertilizer industry, right, which has impacts not only on farmers who are forced to handle these kinds of chemicals in the fields, and this has been a huge environmental justice issue since the 70s, since actually the traditional environmental movements have coincided with the farm workers movements and across the country, and part of this and the fertilizers exposures and health impacts have been a huge part of that. The other part of the flip side of that is actually the production of these fertilizers as well. A lot of these plants, I knew of one in a Black community called Institute, West Virginia. A lot of those plants are located in these communities as well. So there's that sort of pairing to think about as well. And it's I wanted to make sure to talk about that one because that's sort of a lesser. That's lesser in our less prevalent in our discourse, about both climate change, but then also about the kind of environmental justice impacts. Right. Does anyone have any outstanding questions? I hope that I provided at least a sort of start of how we might think about these particular issues intersected with these sort of particular environmental justice cases. I think that the bottom line here is that there's still these sort of silos, that are very much present in our discussions about these things. So I would argue that we, really cannot talk about, particularly in our public discourse, about any of these sort of greenhouse gas emissions or these sort of causal factors and climate change without actually connecting them directly to the other sort of human impacts that are compounded by the industries that are producing them. And I think that if we can make those connections clearer and clearer not only to ourselves but to the public, then we may have a better shot in our sort of climate change advocacy.
I'll pose this to you real quick. 2 extra minutes. I don't live in North Carolina. I'm from Washington, D.C., so we don't have hog farms there. We have our own EJ issues, but we don't have some of the ones here. I'm not sure who in the room is actually from North Carolina or you're here for school. But I would like to ask you, Danielle, why should someone who, even if you're not from this area or an area, you may live in a lovely community where it's sunshine and roses and children skip to the street all day, but why should you be concerned about the EJ issues that are going on in other places so you can take action for them, especially if you're not from an area that's happening to you or at least someone else you know?
Yeah, well, first, there's always an environmental justice issue happening in your backyard. It doesn't matter sort of where you are, you find it, right? It's there if you sort of look at it and look for it. But the second thing is I actually think that this is a reason why climate change actually could bring people together, right? Because the global impacts, of these things that have been happening or have been sort of construed or framed as local issues, are going to impact all of us, right? And so it's not we can no longer think of the industrial hog farming as a North Carolina or Iowa issue, right? They're spreading, those sort of industries are spreading across the country. There's a lot in Alabama right now, too, and proliferating. But the sort of global impacts from having these industries continue to proliferate and continue to create sort of complementary industries to keep them in place, ultimately will have enormous impacts, They may be slower and we may not be able to sort of say this particular event, is targeted we can trace it back to this particular, right, like, you know, emission or, right, like, or event. But the whole purpose is, right, like, trying to build a connection so we create a holistic picture of, like, actually how a global ecosystem works, so that it doesn't matter where you live, right? You should be concerned about what's happening even all the way across the globe.
And I made a decision as of January 1st, no more pork or beef. And eventually I'm moving away from poultry as well, because I don't want to contribute to that. And I think that, you know, that's an example, at least that's my personal story today, or an example of how what I saw here and the impact that I've had just meeting people that live in Duplin County and places like that that are impacted by this. Not just the storm made it worse. And that's how climate change intersected with that environmental issue. But no matter where you are, if you're eating pork that's produced in North Carolina, you're supporting what's going on in those areas. So I think that we have to start making conscious choices, what we can eliminate or cut back on to not support that.
And to add to that, anything that's going into our oceans, you know, we need to be aware of that. I think we're not aware. We've always thought of the ocean to get up and handle water and shit.
Even down to the plastics. We need to be aware of these plastics we're using. Non-recyclable material we use. We use your glass straws. I mean, I'm sure the people in this class have a tendency to do that, but we need to share that with our families, with our friends, maybe talk to restaurants.
I think, you know, sort of my view on it is sort of, we need all of it, and what we need more than anything, right, are sort of structural, right, solutions to this, right? So it's really, it's never going to be enough for 1,000 people here, 1,000 people there to, like, stop using plastic straws, right? Like, we actually need, like, regime change about actually the production of plastics, period, right, and distribution. But, you know, understanding, right, that, like, the pathway to that, right, like, starts a lot of times at the individual level, right? So I never want to sort of pit those things against one another, but to sort of push, like, okay, I'm getting this now for myself, right? So what does that mean? Who can I sort of bring into the fold? How can I actually plug in to other like-minded folks who are trying to build larger, right, like, sort of more structural change around these things, so that they're just not available, whether you like it or not, right? Like, the thing that that we're not producing in these particular ways anymore, right? And that is the only thing that will actually sort of stem the tide of what's to come, right? If we don't figure it out.
Let's thank Danielle for her